Behind the white columns of a grand southern mansion, hidden beneath the scent of magnolia blossoms and the heavy silence of a Georgia summer, lived a story that history tried to bury. A story of a woman who owned everything the antebellum South could offer: land, power, and a name carved in stone, and yet lost the only thing that truly mattered. What happens when a mother's love becomes her greatest weapon and her deepest curse? What happens when the walls of a beautiful home hold more suffering than any battlefield ever could? Stay until the very end, because this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, power, loyalty, and the devastating price of silence. And before we begin, tell us in the comments, have you ever heard a story passed down in your family that felt almost too painful to repeat? Because this one is exactly that kind of story. The year is 1847. On the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, where the moss-draped oak trees line red dirt roads and the summer heat presses down like a heavy, unforgiving hand, stands Whitmore Hall, a three-story plantation mansion with white columns visible from half a mile away. Savannah in 1847 is a city of extraordinary contradictions. On its cobblestone streets and in its elegant squares, decorated with fountains and flowering trees, wealthy merchants and cotton planters stroll in fine linen suits, tipping their hats to one another as if the world is perfectly ordered and perfectly just. The riverfront hums with commerce, bales of cotton loaded onto steamboats bound for the textile mills of the Northeast and across the Atlantic to England. The city smells of salt water, horse, and money. But behind those elegant facades, behind the wrought-iron gates and the magnolia-shaded gardens, Savannah breathes a darker air, because this prosperity, every cobblestone, every fountain, every silk dress, rests entirely on the backs of enslaved human beings whose labor is extracted by force, whose families can be separated at any moment by the stroke of a pen and the exchange of coin. Whitmore Hall belongs to Edmund Whitmore, a cotton merchant of considerable wealth and considerable cruelty, a man who attends church every Sunday in a pressed white shirt and speaks of providence with the easy confidence of someone who has never once questioned whether providence might be looking back at him with judgment rather than favor. But this story is not truly about Edmund. It is about his wife, Margaret Elaine Whitmore. Margaret was raised in Charleston, South Carolina, a city even older in its aristocratic pretensions than Savannah, a city of grand church steeples, of harbor breezes carrying the smell of pluff mud and salt, of Battery Street mansions where enslaved people moved silently through rooms lit by crystal chandeliers. Charleston in the 1830s, where Margaret spent her girlhood, was one of the wealthiest cities in North America. It was also the city through which more enslaved Africans entered the United States than any other port in the country. Margaret grew up knowing this the way one knows the weather, as an ambient fact of existence, unremarked upon, accepted. Her father, Colonel Harlan Beaumont, ran one of the most prosperous rice plantations along the South Carolina coast. Her mother, a woman of French Huguenot descent, taught Margaret embroidery, piano, and the art of social composure, that particular skill of Southern womanhood that required a lady to smile through discomfort, to redirect dangerous conversations with a gentle laugh, and to never, under any circumstances, ask questions that might unsettle the order of things. Margaret arrived at Whitmore Hall at the age of 19, beautiful, composed, trained to near perfection in the performance of graceful ignorance. She had been promised to Edmund by her father, a transaction dressed in lace and spoken vows. And for the first years of her marriage, Margaret played her role with terrifying precision. She managed the household with efficiency. She entertained Edmund's business associates, men from Savannah, from Augusta, from the Sea Islands off the Georgia coast, with impeccable grace. She bore 2 sons. She attended the Presbyterian Church on Bull Street in Savannah every Sunday without fail, and she watched, Because Margaret Whitmore, beneath the performance, was a woman with eyes that missed very little. And Whitmore Hall had secrets older than its foundation. In the quarters behind the main house, a cluster of low wooden structures where the enslaved workers lived in conditions of deliberate deprivation, there was a woman named Celestine. Celestine was approximately 35 years old in 1847, though no one had ever troubled to record her birth with any precision. She had been born in Georgia, the daughter of a woman brought from the coastal regions of West Africa, and she carried within her a knowledge of plants, of bodies, of the rhythms of birth and death that made her indispensable to the county in a way that no one was entirely comfortable acknowledging. Celestine was a midwife. She had delivered babies across 3 counties, white babies in plantation bedrooms hung with silk curtains, and black babies born in the dirt-floored quarters with no curtains at all. Doctors called for her when their own knowledge failed them. Women in labor asked for her by name. She moved through the world of the antebellum Georgia Low Country with a quiet authority that existed entirely in defiance of every law that sought to reduce her to property. She was also the mother of 3 children, all born into bondage at Whitmore Hall, all legally owned by Edmund Whitmore. And Celestine had seen, with the careful and precise eyes of a woman who had learned that survival depended on seeing clearly what no one else at Whitmore Hall dared to acknowledge directly. Margaret Whitmore was drowning, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the slow, terrible certainty of a woman sinking beneath the surface of a life she had been handed without her consent, in a marriage she had not chosen, in a social order that had decided her value before she drew her first breath. The 2 women, one enslaved, one nominally free, but both profoundly imprisoned, began to circle each other with the wary attention of people who recognize, against all logic and all social prohibition, something of themselves in the other. It would be the most dangerous recognition either of them ever allowed themselves. Before we move forward, we want to ask you something personal. Do you have relatives, or perhaps people in your community, who carry memories or stories from this era of American history? If so, we invite you to subscribe to this channel and share those stories in the comments. This community exists to keep these voices alive, and your story matters more than you know. By the spring of 1851, 4 years had settled over Whitmore Hall like sediment, slowly, quietly, changing the shape of everything beneath. Margaret's 2 sons, William and Charles, were growing into the image of their father, confident, entitled, already being groomed to inherit a world built on suffering they were being carefully taught not to see. The plantation had expanded. Edmund had purchased additional land along the Savannah River, bringing more enslaved workers onto the property. The cotton yields were strong. By every external measure, Whitmore Hall was a success, and yet there was a child in the quarters whose presence made the air at Whitmore Hall feel different, heavier, charged with the kind of tension that precedes a storm. Celestine's youngest daughter, a girl named Iris. Iris was 6 years old in 1851, and she'd been born with light grey eyes that caught the sun in a way that made people uncomfortable and caused Edmund Whitmore to find reasons to leave whatever room she entered. She had Celestine's high cheekbones and her mother's quiet watchfulness, but other features, the particular set of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders, these belonged to someone else entirely. In the social world of the antebellum Georgia Low Country, this was not a mystery anyone was willing to solve aloud. The truth that everyone understood and no one named hung over Whitmore Hall like the Spanish moss that draped its oak trees, heavy, pervasive, and impossible to remove without damaging the structure it clung to. Margaret knew. Of course, Margaret knew. What she chose to do with that knowledge is the axis on which this entire story turns. Another woman in her position, and there were many such women across Georgia, across South Carolina, across the vast and brutal machinery of the antebellum South, might have responded with the cruelty that the system both permitted and encouraged, might have made Iris's life a site of punishment for a crime the child had not committed and could not comprehend. Margaret did the opposite. Quietly, carefully, at considerable personal risk, she began to protect Iris. She arranged for the girl to work inside the main house rather than in the fields. She ensured Iris was adequately fed and clothed. And then, in an act that was not merely unconventional, but explicitly illegal under Georgia state law, she began to teach Iris to read. In the evenings, by the thin light of a tallow candle, Margaret would sit with Iris in the back room off the kitchen, a space used for storing linens and largely ignored by Edmund, and trace letters onto a slate board she had obtained under the pretense of using it for her son's lessons. She taught the alphabet, she taught the sound of words, she taught a 6-year-old child who was legally classified as property how to transform symbols on a surface into meaning. Georgia law in 1851 was unambiguous on this matter. Teaching an enslaved person to read was a criminal offense, subject to fine and imprisonment. The law existed for a reason that its architects understood perfectly. Literacy is a form of power, and power in the hands of the enslaved was the thing the entire system was designed to prevent. Margaret knew this. She taught Iris anyway. Some nights, after Iris had been returned to the quarters, Margaret would sit alone in the darkened hallway outside her bedroom and listen through the thin walls to the sound of Celestine singing her daughter to sleep. Low, melodic songs, in a language that was partly English and partly something older, carried across water and generations. The expression on Margaret's face during these moments was described by the one person who occasionally witnessed it, an elderly enslaved woman named Dovey, who worked as the household cook, as something she had no word for. Not happiness, not sadness. Something that contained both and went further than either. Celestine, for her part, received Margaret's attention with the complex intelligence of a woman who had never had the luxury of simple feelings. She was not fooled by Margaret's gestures into believing that a white plantation mistress in antebellum Georgia could be fully trusted. History offered no precedent for that. The protection of a woman like Margaret was real, but it was also contingent on Edmund's ignorance, on social circumstance, on the 1,000 variables that governed life in a system where one signature could undo everything. But Celestine also saw something in Margaret that was rare in her experience of white womanhood in the Georgia Low Country. She saw genuine shame, not the performative emotionality of a woman seeking to feel virtuous while changing nothing, but something that lived in the body, that surfaced in unguarded moments, that suggested Margaret understood, on some level she could not yet fully articulate, the nature of her own complicity. This recognition did not make Celestine trust Margaret, but it made her watch her with a different quality of attention. And then, in the spring of 1852, a traveling preacher arrived. His name was Reverend Josiah Calhoun, and he had come from Columbia, South Carolina, making a circuit through the Georgia Low Country, stopping at plantation homes to conduct evening services for the families of the planter class. He was tall, thin, pious, in the performative way of men who use religion as social currency, and he stayed 3 nights at Whitmore Hall as Edmund's guest. On the second night of his visit, Reverend Calhoun rose from his bed past midnight, claiming later that he had been unable to sleep and had gone to the kitchen for water. What he found instead, in the small back room off the kitchen, was Margaret Whitmore, mistress of one of the most prominent plantations in Chatham County, sitting on a low stool beside an enslaved child, holding a candle over a slate board, her finger tracing letters while the child's lips moved in silent repetition. Reverend Calhoun said nothing in that moment. He withdrew silently. The following morning at breakfast, he was cordial and gave no indication of what he had seen. He departed after the noon meal, shaking Edmund's hand warmly and complimenting the quality of the Whitmore table. 2 weeks later, Edmund Whitmore received a letter. What that letter contained, and what Edmund did with it, would shatter Whitmore Hall from its foundation to the top of its white columns, and send consequences rippling outward through Savannah, through Charleston, through the parlors of New Orleans, where the Whitmore name carried the weight of old money and older ambition. We want to stop here and ask you directly, what do you think of Margaret's choices so far? Was she acting out of genuine conscience or out of guilt that could never truly be enough? Was her protection of Iris an act of courage or an act that ultimately put a child in greater danger? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This is exactly the kind of conversation this community was built for. And if you carry family stories from this period of American history, please subscribe to this channel. These stories deserve to be heard, and this community needs your voice. Edmund Whitmore read Reverend Calhoun's letter on a Tuesday morning in June of 1852, seated at the mahogany desk in his study on the second floor of Whitmore Hall, with the windows open to a Savannah summer that smelled of magnolia and the distant salt of the Georgia coast. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, placed it in the top drawer of his desk, and locked the drawer. He did not speak to Margaret that day, or the next. On the third day, he acted. Before dawn on a Friday morning, while the Georgia low country lay still under a sky not yet fully light, Edmund Whitmore arranged for Celestine and her 3 children to be sold. He had made the arrangements in private, through a broker he used for such transactions, a man based in Augusta who specialized in what the trade euphemistically called difficult placements. Celestine's 2 older children, a boy of 14 named Solomon and a girl of 11 named Ruth, were sold to separate buyers. Solomon went to a cotton operation in the Mississippi Delta. Ruth was purchased by a family in coastal North Carolina. Their destinations were noted in the transaction ledger with the same emotional register as entries for livestock. Iris, 6 years old, with light grey eyes and an alphabet she had learned in secret, was sold to a sugar plantation outside New Orleans, Louisiana. A world away from Georgia in distance, and further still in the particular brutality of its labor system. Louisiana's sugar fields had a reputation, even within the brutal calculus of American slavery, for consuming human beings at a rate that made other slaveholders uncomfortable to contemplate. Celestine herself was sent to a labor operation in Natchez, Mississippi, a city on the bluffs above the river that was, in 1852, one of the most active slave-trading hubs in the American South. The Natchez Trace, the auction blocks, the places where the machinery of human commerce operated in its most naked form. Margaret was given no warning. She was told nothing until the morning it happened. She came downstairs at her usual hour, dressed in her morning clothes, and found the house in an unusual state of quiet activity. Men she did not recognize moving through the back of the property with purpose. She went to the back steps, and she saw. Celestine stood in the yard in the early morning light, her hands bound, her children pressed close against her. Iris was holding the hem of her mother's dress with both fists, her face very still in the way that children's faces become still when they understand that something is happening that no one is going to explain to them. Celestine looked up and met Margaret's eyes. That moment, documented by Dovey the cook, who witnessed it from the kitchen window and would speak of it for the rest of her long life, lasted perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, something passed between the 2 women that no record can fully capture. Dovey described it years later to her grandchildren in the freedmen's settlement where she lived after emancipation as a look that contained everything: fury, grief, recognition, and a kind of terrible knowledge that the world had always been exactly this, and no amount of secret kindness could unmake it. Margaret did not move from the steps. She did not call out. She did not attempt to intervene. She stood beneath the white columns of Whitmore Hall in the Georgia summer light, and she watched the wagon carry Celestine and Iris down the red dirt road, past the moss-draped oaks, and around the bend where the road curved and the trees closed in, and they were gone. That silence, that absolute devastating stillness, is what Dovey said she could never forget. Not screaming, not weeping, just standing there, watching, until there was nothing left to watch. In the months that followed, Margaret Whitmore became a different kind of person. She stopped attending church. She declined all social invitations. She sent her sons, William and Charles, to live with her parents in Charleston, South Carolina, telling Edmund only that she felt unable to properly supervise their education in her current state of health. Edmund, whose attention was increasingly occupied by a new business venture in New Orleans, a city where he had cultivated connections in both the cotton trade and the more shadowed economies that operated alongside it, offered little resistance. Whitmore Hall grew quiet, and in that quiet, Margaret wrote. She wrote with the focused, relentless energy of a woman who understands she is running out of time. Letters, addressed to members of the abolitionist network she had carefully, secretly cultivated through a connection made years earlier with a group of Quaker women who gathered in Savannah under the socially acceptable pretense of a charitable sewing circle. The letters were detailed, clinical even. They documented the operations of Whitmore Hall with the precision of someone who had spent years observing and cataloguing names of enslaved people, their ages, the conditions of the quarters, the specific practices Edmund used to maintain control, the transaction records she had seen, the buying and selling of human beings recorded in ledgers kept in the locked drawer of his mahogany desk. She wrote about Solomon and Ruth, whose destinations she had pieced together through careful conversation with the remaining workers. She wrote about New Orleans and what she knew of the sugar country west of the city. She wrote about Natchez and the trade routes along the Mississippi River. And she wrote about Iris. She wrote the name Iris into every letter, as if repetition could somehow fix the child's existence into the historical record with enough force to survive whatever came next. She was 30 years old. She had never been to New Orleans. She had never seen the Mississippi Delta or the cotton fields of Mississippi or the auction blocks of Natchez. She had seen, from the carefully managed vantage point of plantation womanhood, only the surface of a system, whose depths she was only now, at great cost, beginning to fully comprehend. Edmund discovered the letters in October of 1852. He had returned from New Orleans unexpectedly and found Margaret at her writing desk in the upstairs sitting room, surrounded by pages covered in her precise, careful handwriting. She made no attempt to conceal what she was doing. Witnesses reported that she looked up when he entered the room and met his eyes with an expression of absolute steadiness. No fear, no apology, no attempt at explanation. Edmund read enough of what she had written to understand its full implication. What followed was handled through the mechanisms that Southern society of the era had developed precisely for such situations. Mechanisms designed to contain, discredit, and silence women whose behavior threatened the social order. Lawyers were consulted. Family members in Charleston were notified. Physicians with flexible professional ethics were employed. By the spring of 1853, Margaret Elaine Whitmore had been committed to the Georgia Lunatic Asylum in Milledgeville, a facility located in the geographic heart of Georgia, in a city that served as the state capital, where the architecture of governance and the architecture of confinement stood within sight of each other. The legal mechanism used was straightforward: a husband's petition, 2 physicians' signatures. The diagnosis recorded in the admission documents was moral insanity, complicated by nervous exhaustion and delusional ideation with respect to the social order. In the medical and legal language of 1853, this was sufficient. She was 31 years old when she entered Milledgeville. She died there in the autumn of 1857, at the age of 35. The cause of death recorded in the asylum's ledger was 4 words: exhaustion of the nerves. Whitmore Hall stood empty for years before the Civil War consumed the world that had produced it. By 1865, the columns had begun to crack, the fields had gone to weeds, and Edmund Whitmore had died of fever in New Orleans. Far from Georgia, far from the mansion whose name he had placed on the world with such confidence, the letters Margaret had written in those final months of her freedom were never sent. Edmund had confiscated them, but he had not destroyed them, perhaps from some legal instinct to retain evidence, or perhaps from some darker impulse to keep them as proof of his own power over her. They were found in 1891. During the demolition of the wing, Edmund had used as his study, bundled in oilcloth inside a sealed compartment beneath the floorboards, dry, intact, and perfectly legible, as if the house had decided that something should not be allowed to disappear. The letters were acquired by a private collector in Savannah, then donated to a historical archive in the early 20th century, where they sat in a box for decades before a researcher came across them and understood what she was holding. As for Celestine, the records of the Natchez slave trade are incomplete, as are most such records, deliberately so. But in the documentation of a freedmen's community established in Lafourche Parish in Louisiana after emancipation, there is an entry for a woman named Celestine, age approximately 50, occupation listed as midwife, noted as having arrived in the parish from Mississippi sometime in the late 1860s. Whether this is the same woman, history declines to confirm. But those who study this period allow themselves to hope, because hope is sometimes the most honest response to an incomplete record. Iris does not appear in any subsequent documentation that has been located. She was 6 years old when she was taken to the sugar country west of New Orleans. She had just begun to learn the alphabet. She knew perhaps a dozen letters with any confidence. She had light grey eyes that caught the sun. She was swallowed by a system designed with extraordinary precision and deliberate thoroughness to erase people exactly like her. Her name was Iris, and it is the least we can do to say it. To every person who stayed with this story until its final word, thank you. From the bottom of this community and with the full weight of what this history carries, thank you for your time, your attention, and your willingness to sit with something difficult and true. The story of Whitmore Hall, of Margaret, of Celestine, and of Iris is a work of fiction, but it is built from the bones of real history, real places, and the real documented experiences of real human beings who lived and suffered, and sometimes against all odds survived in the antebellum American South. Savannah is still there, Charleston is still there, New Orleans is still there, Milledgeville is still there, the buildings stand, the streets carry the same names. The history is underfoot everywhere you walk in the American South, if you know how to look for it. We would be deeply honored to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments what this story meant to you, what moved you, what troubled you, what you will carry with you after the screen goes dark. Subscribe to this channel if you want to continue this conversation, because we are just beginning. And do not go far. The next video is Waiting, and what it holds will reach even deeper into the history that made us all. This story is a work of fiction inspired by the historical realities of the antebellum American South. The characters, specific events, and dialogue are fictional. The history is real.